The problem is I did not shoot my kids, and I can prove it.
Well, I hope so.
No, you don't.
I don't believe you, Diane. I just don't believe you.
Tell me why.
Number one, I don't believe you'd stop for any motherfucker in the middle of the road at 11 o'clock at night. At all. At all with your children. If you love your children all as much as you say, you would never do that. Never. I just know you too well. You'd never do that. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. And that I told you that I wasn't moving to Oregon, didn't want to be a daddy. I think you just decided to get rid of him.
That doesn't hold water, because you said that how many times before, Nick, and you always changed your mind.
Yeah, well, I didn't change my mind the last time.
It always takes you 3 months.
Oh, okay.
This is an Eyewitness News special report. In her own words, Elizabeth Diane Downs.
Good evening. I'm Ann Bradley. What you're about to see is a conversation with Elizabeth Diane Downs in November. In the next 30 minutes, we're going to try to give you the inside story about what Elizabeth Diane Downs is like, in her own words. How she feels about her life, her former marriage, her children, and the events that have happened over the past year. You may be wondering why we haven't aired this interview. Eyewitness News waited until now because of the sensitivity of some of the things said, and it does contain some graphic language. These comments represent Elizabeth Diane Downs' thoughts and opinions and are not necessarily shared by KEZI. We've also been concerned about the effect of this material on potential jurors. Now that a jury has been picked, we want to share some of the background of the Downs case with you. Let's start by taking a look back at what happened May 19th, 1983. A year ago...
Alright, so welcome everybody. So if you watched the last video, the one about why narcissistic parents are not good parents, or why narcissists are not good parents, I covered a video, or I commented on a video from Little Shaman, and she mentioned a few people in that video. And one of the people she mentioned was Diane Downs. So I dove in a little deeper to figure out what really happened in that situation, to find out why she was saying what she was saying about her, and to really kind of dig into the story. And so this is what we're going to cover today. We're going to cover the story of Diane Downs, who shot her 3 kids in an attempt to get her lover back. I guess that's basically all you can call him, because she was the mistress to the guy. Like, the guy was married, she was the mistress, and she thought the only way to get him to come to her was to get rid of the kids, because he made it very clear that he didn't want to be a dad. And we're going to cover that in a future video, because this is actually going to be, I think, a 3-part series. But for now, sorry about that, that's my phone going off. But for now, let's dive in. Like I said, you know, I really dove into this because I wanted to see what she was talking about. Like, and I'm even going to actually look into the other 2 that she had mentioned. In the last video that I posted, like I said, Little Shaman mentioned 3 different people who did horrific things. So I'm actually going to look into all 3 of those cases. This just happens to be the first of those cases. And this is the case of Diane Downs.
This week, one of the most horrendous crimes took place along this stretch of Old Mohawk Road east of Eugene. A 28-year-old woman and her 3 small children were brutally shot. Elizabeth Diane Downs says the family was on a sightseeing trip when a shaggy-haired stranger flagged her down and demanded her car. She refused, and the assailant shot Downs and her children at close range with a .22 caliber gun. 9-year-old Christy was shot first. through the hand into the chest as she tried to protect herself. 3-year-old Danny was shot in the back and is now paralyzed from the waist down. 7-year-old Cheryl was shot twice from behind and died on the way to the hospital. Police searched the brush and nearby river looking for the murder weapon. The gun was never found, and neither was the shaggy-haired stranger. Police started suspecting Downs as the culprit. The prosecution claims her obsessive love for an ex-boyfriend in Arizona was her motive. The state says Downs felt her children were getting in the way and preventing a romantic relationship with that former boyfriend. And strangely enough, even the people who knew Downs best questioned her account of the shootings on the night of the murder. Downs' father, Wes Fredrickson. Was there ever a time from the beginning when you first heard that you had any doubts about her innocence?
Was there a time when I had doubts? Yes, there was. The first night, as a matter of fact, I had doubts. I felt, I sat and I sized up the situation, and I saw at one point that Diane had been shot in the, and everybody knows her as Elizabeth, but Diane had been shot in the left arm, and she's right-handed, and I made the comment to the police department there that night. It looks to me like Diane did it, because the children have been shot in the chest, and Diane has only been shot in the arm. And I says, it really looks like she did it.
And that in itself, like, that really is what doesn't make sense to me, is like, she's got, like he said, her kids were shot in the chest and one was shot in the back. And yet she was only shot in the arm. And you're going to find out her version of the story as we get into this 3-part series, is you're going to see the reenactment of what happened that night. And you're going to see the way that she had supposedly pushed off the suspect and drove away and sped away without being shot any other time. Even though this guy that she claimed shot her kids only shot her in the arm. Like, that in itself doesn't make sense to me. Because, like, I mean, I think even Ted Bundy was before this, because this was in 1983, and I think Ted Bundy was in the 70s. But even he was smart enough to know you don't leave witnesses behind. You know what I mean? So, why would somebody who would shoot 3 kids leave a grown person alive to be able to explain to the cops as to who shot her kids? Like, they wouldn't do that. That's, especially if it's out on the middle, or I'm sorry, yeah, in the middle of the night on a dark road by himself. It just doesn't make sense. Like, it's gonna make more sense as we get into it. It's gonna bring up more questions. I'm sorry, it's gonna bring up more questions as we get into it. But that, like I said, I've dug deep into this case, so I know a little more about it than what's being said in this particular video. But he makes some very key points. It's like she was only shot in the arm while the other 3 kids were maliciously shot in a clear attempted murder type of situation, even though Diane was only shot in the arm. Not the chest, not the head, not the leg, only in the arm. And the left arm at that, while being right-handed.
And I says, it really looks like she did it. That really is the thing that spurred them to go and check, to do the Q-tips, run the Q-tips around her finger to check for the powder residue, and to also spray her hands to see if she held a gun. So it was a good thing that I expressed that. And I'm a very open person. If I think that somebody did something, I'm not about to hesitate to say they didn't. You know, I'll tell them that I think they did. And I'd say the same thing again if I believed it. I've had plenty of opportunity to follow, and that's one of the main reasons, I guess, for peace of mind. I've followed through, and I know that my daughter didn't do it.
That part I don't believe. You followed through, and you know for a fact your daughter didn't do it. And as we go into the next, like I said, this is going to be like at least a 2 or 3 part series. So as we go into the rest of the story, you're gonna really be able to break this down. But let's keep going, because But just keep that in mind. Is he brought it up, the fact that he thinks she did it, and now he's turning around and saying that he thinks that she didn't do it. So let's keep going, and you tell me what you think.
I've been through that night so many times. I've even been through it with my psychologist. It's very hard. It's very tearful. There are a lot of memories that I don't know. A lot of people, when something traumatic happens to them, they suppress it immediately. I kept those memories because I knew that I was the only person that was going to be able to tell them what happened when we got to the hospital. And when I got there, the first thing I said was call the doctors. Second thing was the blood type. Third thing was call the cops because they've got to find him. And so I had to remember as much as I could remember. When this man shot my daughter, my first reaction was to snap back to my childhood, to the pain that had happened to me back then.
Alright, so when she thought about this man shooting her daughter, the first thing she thought about was her childhood. And notice there's no expression on her face of sadness or grief or anything like that. It's literally like a matter-of-fact type of confession.
Marriage, my entrapment by society. This man was bigger than me. He was stronger than me. He had more power because he had a gun. He was in control and I was not. And there was nothing I could do. And I stood there and I looked at Christy reaching, and the blood that just kept gushing out of her mouth. What do? You just stand there trapped. And then the gun kept firing and firing and firing. And it was monotonous. It just kept going. It was like a slow motion picture.
Like, you can't tell me that's not a rehearsed story. There's no emotion in this whatsoever. Anybody who is describing an event where their kids get shot is going to be very emotional. I would. If somebody shot my kid and it took his life or caused him to be paralyzed or caused him to have significant what's the word? That caused him significant trauma. Like, yeah, I'm gonna be very emotional about that because you shot my kid. Like, and me personally, I'm gonna be looking for justice if I'm not looking to whoop your ass. Like, me personally in this situation, if you shot my kid, whether you killed him or whether you injured him, whatever the case may be, I'm gonna hunt you down. And you better hope to God the cops find you before I do, because I'm gonna fuck you up. But she has none of that type of mentality. She's literally just like going through a rehearsed story. And that's what it seems like to me. It's just a rehearsed story. She's already planned this out. She's already figured out what her story was going to be. And she's just basically running through the script.
And then he swung around towards me, and this is something that I did not recall when I was explaining to the cops, because it wasn't like a movie when I was telling them. I was telling them what happened, the important details. He shot my kids, I pushed him, I ran. And when he swung around, he was pointing, when he swung around, it hit the tips of my fingers. The gun hit the tips of my fingers, and that snapped me. And I went, wait a minute. I'm not trapped by society. I don't care if he is bigger. If I stand here and I say, yeah, here, take the keys. I mean, there's nothing I can do. You win because you have the gun. My kids are going to die. And I'm not.
But according to her own story, they had already been shot by that point. So, I mean, just let me know in the comments how that one makes sense. Like, by her own admissions, by then they had already been shot. By the time she had faked throwing the keys and whatever, you know, when she jumped in the car and hauled off, according to her, the kids have already been shot. And to her knowledge, they were already dead. So to say that if I let this man take me, my kids are going to die, but he'd already shot them. And according to her, in her own words, it was just gunfire after gunfire after gunfire. Like, this just doesn't make sense. Like, and that's how narcissists are. It's like, their story does not make sense at all. They will just go into this story mode that they think makes sense, but doesn't make sense to anybody else, anybody who's actually thinking rationally.
I'm going to let my kids die. And so instead of giving him the keys, I feigned throwing the keys. He did not take time to point the gun and shoot me, obviously, because he would have shot me the same way he did the kids. When he was swinging in the direction of the keys, firing the gun, he hit my arm.
Okay, but here's the problem with that scenario. He wasn't aiming the gun because he was swinging in the direction where I have faked throwing the keys. Okay, even if you faked throwing the keys, by her own admission, she still had to jump in the car, put the keys in ignition, and start the car up. That takes several seconds. By then, the man could have easily turned around and shot her point blank in the head and took care of everybody. So that doesn't make sense.
Everybody says you sure were lucky. Well, I don't feel very lucky. I couldn't tie my damn shoes for about 2 months. It is very painful. It is still painful.
You see, she said, all right, that's a very narcissistic thing to say right there. It's like she says, well, everybody says you were lucky. Well, I don't feel very lucky because I couldn't tie my shoes for a month. That's how you feel unlucky? All 3 of your kids were shot. But you feel unlucky because you couldn't tie your shoes for a month? And she even smirked about it when she said it. That's your problem? Is that you couldn't tie your shoes for a month. Not the fact that one of your kids were dead. Not the fact that one of your kids were paralyzed. Not the fact that the other one was in a coma. But the fact you couldn't tie your shoe for a month. That's how you felt unlucky. That's a very narcissistic thing to say. And that just shows where her mind is. The only person she's concerned about is how it affected her.
I have a steel plate on my arm. I will for 1.5 years. The scar is going to be there forever. I'm going to remember that night for the rest of my life, whether I want to or not. I don't think I was very lucky. I think my kids were lucky. If I had been shot the way they were, we all would have died.
Her kids were lucky? Are you kidding me? She's unlucky because she's got a steel plate in her arm. She's unlucky because she couldn't tie her shoe for a month. But her kids were lucky because one of them was shot to death. The other one was shot to the point where they were put in a coma or ICU. The other one was shot to the point he was paralyzed. And they're the lucky ones? That's a very... And this is why I wanted to cover this story, is because it really puts the last video into clear perspective as to how narcissists really think and how they really act and how they really communicate their thoughts and their feelings and everything and like that. Is because in this situation, her only thought, her only concern is how it affected her. Her kids were lucky because one was shot to death, one was paralyzed, and the other one was put in a coma. And she only got a steel plate in the arm. So she's the unlucky one? I bet any one of them 3 kids would have been happy to walk out of there with a steel plate in their arm. But she's the unlucky one.
Except maybe Danny.
What haunts you the most about that night?
What do I see most is blood coming out of Christy's mouth. Because that's what I see. I can't see Danny, and I can't see Cher. Sherry was laying on the floor, and driving to the hospital, I don't know the sounds that were made at the initial shooting because I was on the outside, and all I could hear, I can't hear anything but gunshots. And I can see things, you know, that's it. Driving to the hospital, I can smell blood. I can not hear Cheryl. Cheryl's not making a sound. Danny is just crying real soft. So that sound stays in my mind, and the fact that Christy's choking. And then I'm yelling at her, I'm screaming at her to roll over on her face because I was trying to keep her from choking on her blood, and it just didn't dawn on me that she was shot in the chest and that the blood was coming from her chest, not going down into her chest.
I don't know if any of y'all caught that part of her story, the way she was smirking as she was telling the story. That's a big red flag. To me personally, that's a big red flag. Somebody who can literally retell the events of that night with a smirk rather than tears lets you know something else happened.
Down says her childhood and marriage flashed before her the night of the murder. Diane is the oldest of 4 Frederickson children, and she says her childhood is a great source of pain in her life.
How did your childhood affect you?
Everything that happens to you as a child contributes to how you turn out as an adult. To be honest, it made me a better person because I know all the mistakes. I know what not to do to my kids.
And you see, look, oh, that's a perfect place to pause it. Look how she's smirking when she says that. And this is a common theme among serial killers, is they always blame it on their childhood. Ted Bundy did the same thing. But yet, many women died at his hands, and in very brutal fashions. And that's not all that happened, but you know the story of Ted Bundy. But he blamed it on his childhood, and that's what every serial killer does, is they blame it on their childhood. But in the end, it's their victims who paid the price for what they're claiming happened to them. And for somebody to sit here and say, well, I know how not to treat my kids, but you shot your kids for a man that didn't want kids. So to sit here and say that my childhood taught me how to not treat my kids while simultaneously shooting your kids in an attempt to kill your kids because you thought it would bring back a man that did not want to be a dad. She was so in love with this dude that she thought the only way to get him to come to her, because he was married, and she thought the only way to get him to choose her over his wife was to take out the kids, because he made it very clear he didn't want to be a dad. So she said, okay, if this is what I got to do to get you, this is what I'm going to do. And she's sitting here saying it with a smile on her face while talking about, well, my childhood taught me how not to treat my kids. Again, leave in the comments how that one makes sense.
I know what to avoid. One thing is to not be married. And that may seem very harsh, but I honestly don't believe that children need fathers. And they're nice to have around sometimes when they can do things to help you, but when they are mentally abusive, when they are harsh, and the way my ex-husband was, they're more a deterrent to the children than a help. And unless you can find a good father, there is no need for them.
There's a big problem with there. Like, I'm gonna try to put it in this video. There's a clip I saw of the ex-husband she was talking about, Steve, who, from what I could tell, actually loved his kids and actually wanted to be a good dad. And according to her, according to him, she was the one that was not a very good fit for the kids. So, and that's a very narcissistic thing to do, is they will project their bad behaviors onto other people as to make themselves look like a victim and to put their bad behaviors on somebody else. And that's a very common tactic among narcissists. And Diane Downs is very much a narcissist. Very much a narcissist. Like I said in my last video, I really dug deep into this, like the narcissism spectrum. And she's very, very on the deep end of the malignant end of the spectrum. And if you don't know what that means, I encourage you to actually dive into it yourself to figure out what a malignant narcissist is really like.
Your childhood affect your attitude toward men?
That has A lot to do with it. That had a lot to do with it for many, many, many years. I hated men with a passion.
You see how she says everything with a smirk though? Like, that in itself is a red flag. Like, she's sitting here going through this horrific story of her childhood and what happened to her kids and what happened to her, but she's saying it with a smile, with a smirk, as if it's a joke. Like she's enjoying the attention, and that's what narcissists do. Is they don't care if it's good attention or bad attention, as long as they're getting attention. They love being the center of attention. And that's what she's doing here. Even though she's going through this horrific thing that would devastate most people, to her, she's smiling about it.
But yeah, I hated men for a long time. That's why I met Steve. That's why I married Steve, because Steve did not seem to be that way. Steve was always on his best behavior. He does the thing that most people do when they're dating, and that's put their best foot forward. You're nice, they're punctual, they're everything they're supposed to be. And then you marry them, and it's, hey, Diane, can you let yourself in? I have to run down and look at a car.
Yeah.
That's what he did on our wedding day. Actually, I found it out the day I got married, and then within the next 2 months after that, I found out that Steve was exactly like my father. But it took me 2 years, 3 years, to finally say, I can't take it anymore. He really, really is. He's not going to change. I am a person that believes that everybody's going to change for the better, given the right circumstances. If you be a good wife, if you don't nag, if you love them, if you're always there when they need them, if the food's always ready, if the house is always clean, they're going to change. He didn't change.
All right. Couple key things I want to touch on right there. Number one, she says Steve was exactly like my father. And if you saw the clip that I put in the beginning of this video, her dad didn't seem like a bad dude. Her dad seemed like a straight up kind of dude who would just be upfront and honest about how he felt and what he thought. And so to say Steve was just like her dad kind of more or less seems like a compliment. But then the other part was, she said, well, if I'm a good wife, if I do all this, if I do this and do that, he'll change. But like I said, her dad didn't seem like a bad dude, so if she's comparing Steve to her dad, he couldn't have been that bad of a dude. And when you watch the next video that I post, you're going to see that Steve's really not a bad dude. She's just trying, that's just what narcissists do. Is they try to portray everybody else as the bad person so that they can come off as the victim. And in reality, Steve wanted the kids. Steve was happy to have the kids. But as you watching this interview, she's going to try to make it out like Steve didn't want the kids, when that wasn't true at all. The reality was, she was the bad parent. She was the one who was causing problems. She was the one who was bad to her kids, not Steve. But in her version of the story, and this is the problem with stories, is when you get stories like this, and this is why I dove deep, because I really wanted to find out what really happened and find out both sides of the story. So when you listen to Diane's side of the story and then you listen to Steve's side of the story, they're very contradictory of each other. Like, she's trying to make it out like Steve was just a horrible dude. Like, she was the perfect housewife, she was the perfect mother, that she did all this stuff. In reality, that wasn't the case. That was not true at all. And in fact, the reason she killed her kids was for the man that she left Steve for, or stepped out of her marriage for. Because she was cheating on Steve with this guy named Nick, or Nix, or Knickerbocker, whatever his name was. But she stepped out of her marriage with Steve to have an affair with this dude. And then she ended up leaving Steve for that dude, and that dude decided he didn't want anything to do with her because he didn't want to be a dad. So her next course of action was to take out the kids so that wasn't a problem. So that's why I say You really got to dive deep into these stories to get the real truth of what really happened.
And that's why, even though we were married for 8 years, only 3 of it was not tolerable. It wasn't tolerable, but that was the only 3 that I tried. After that, I quit because I didn't want to be married anymore.
Diane says her marriage with Steve Downs deteriorated when friction arose over an unexpected pregnancy.
Okay, after I had Christy and after I had Cheryl, Steve had a vasectomy. It didn't work. And...
All right. Just play that back real quick because I want to touch on that real quick. Because that, again, is a very narcissistic thing to say. Is what they do is they will take one fact and they'll put it onto somebody else. And this is where the problem is, and I'll explain in a second.
Rose over an unexpected pregnancy.
Okay, after I had Christy and after I had Cheryl, Steve had a vasectomy.
That is not true. The guy Knickerbocker that she was cheating on her husband with, the guy that she killed her kids for, actually is the one who had the vasectomy. Because he said he didn't want to be a dad. That's the real truth of the story. The Knickerbocker guy, the guy she had an affair with, the married man that she had an affair with, he's the actual one who got the vasectomy. Not Steve. Steve was a happy dad. Steve was happy to be a dad, and he loved his kids. And you're going to see that in a minute. But I just want to clear that up. This is what narcissists do. They will take certain facts and they will make it fit wherever it benefits them. So to say, oh, Steve had this vasectomy that didn't work, no, that's not true. Knickerbocker had the vasectomy, not Steve.
It didn't work. And he never went back to get checked to see if it worked. He just figured, doctors know what they're doing, it must have worked. So after, I think it's, you're supposed to wait 10 weeks, be on some kind of contraceptive for 10 weeks, and then you're safe.
And then you check.
But you're supposed to check, yeah. He never went back because he was just too busy, and the doctor probably knew what he was doing. Well, I got pregnant, and I knew that I wasn't messing around with anybody, and that if I was pregnant, because I know what being pregnant feels like.
That again is a lie. She said, I know I wasn't messing around with anybody. And when you watch the next video, you're going to find out she had an affair with 10 different dudes in 2 years. And she claimed that wasn't that many. So when she says she wasn't messing around, that's a lie. Like I said, you'll find that in the next video. I just wanted to point that out. This is how narcissists do. This is what they do. They lie. They combine truths from different situations to make it fit their narrative. You know what I mean? Like, so to say, well, I wasn't messing around with anybody. Well, yeah, you were. And even Steve admitted that. And I'm going to actually play that in the next video that I post. Steve actually admitted that she got around.
Like, I know how I got that way. And I told him about it, and he gave me heck. Oh, he was
is
just
Danny
furious.
or is Danny not?
That was the child that I aborted. Steve put me through hell with that one, and I had an abortion. Cheryl was colicky, Steve was bitching. I made Steve go back to the doctor or shut up. Don't accuse me until you know. The doctor said, yeah, you are fertile. I guess I goofed up. Come on in and we'll go ahead and do it again. Well, I was pregnant. So I was 20 years old, had 2 kids. Cheryl was...
See, she's still putting on Steve. Steve is not the one that got the vasectomy. Knickerbocker was.
Colicky. My husband was a bastard. I'm sorry. And I had an abortion. And it was something that did not bother me for 2 years. And then I was at a fair in Arizona. I walked past a right...
An affair in Arizona, that would be Knickerbocker, the one who actually got the vasectomy. But notice how everything she mentions about what she's been through, she's the victim. And with narcissists, that's a common thing. They're either the hero or they're the victim. Never in between. They're never the bad guy. They're never the villain. They're either the hero or the victim.
to life booth, and they told me at the time that I aborted that I was 6 weeks. And I figured 6 weeks, that is a condition. You are not pregnant, that is a condition. It's a little ball of slime, you know, no big deal. It's a fetus is slime, I figured. I saw a 6-week fetus. That baby had arms, legs, fingers, toes, a head, eyes. That was a baby. It was a human being, and I killed it. And I felt so horrible about it that I had killed somebody like that. I didn't.
Honestly, my personal opinion is I don't believe she aborted it because Steve wanted her to. I believe she aborted it because it was Steve's. That's what I believe. She wanted it to be Knickerbocker's, but it wasn't. Because, as I said, Knickerbocker is the actual one who had the vasectomy. And so she didn't want to have another child by Steve, so she aborted the child. That's my opinion.
Kill it myself, but I hired a doctor to do it. Yeah. And so I asked my husband to have his vasectomy changed, reversed. He refused. I asked him for a year. He kept saying no. I said, fine, I will find a suitable donor. I watched people I worked with. I picked somebody that was attractive, that was healthy.
See, she said, I will find a suitable donor. Means, okay, if you're not going to give me a kid, I'm going to go have a kid with somebody else. And she talks about, in the very beginning of this interview, she said, well, if I was a good wife, if I done this, if I done that, you know, things would change. You know. But for somebody to give somebody an ultimatum, okay, either you give me a child or I'm going to go find a man who will, that's not much of an ultimatum. And in fact, that's a pretty good way to get a man to say, all right, the hell with you. If that's how you feel, we're not going to make it. This marriage ain't going to last if you're willing to step outside of our marriage to have a kid with some other guy.
That was not abusive of drugs and alcohol and such. Was strong, you know, bone structure, the whole bit. A good specimen. It was really clinical. It was really terrible. And I seduced him. And
right, just mind you, this is an interview about what happened to her kids, and she's going into this whole other spiel while smiling about it, while smirking and laughing. Anybody who's dealing with what she claims to have went through would not be smiling about it. They wouldn't be smirking. They wouldn't be happy about it. And there definitely would be tears. But this is how narcissists are, is they're not able to think outside of their own needs.
I know my cycle, and it only took once, and I got pregnant. I went home, and about a week later I told Steve I was pregnant. And he goes, how do you know? And I says, well, I know my cycle, I know I'm pregnant. And he was really upset. For that whole 9 months, he put me through hell. Every day, every night. It was terrible. Just railed on me constantly. Told me to get an abortion. The whole bit. And then after the baby was born, he told me, if you have a girl baby, I might let you stay around. But if you have a boy, I'm kicking you both out on your butts, and you're going to take those two with you also. Because how do I know they're mine?
Again, look, she's smiling through this whole interview. Like, this is a ridiculous thing to be smiling about. You just lost your kid. Well, you just lost one kid. Actually, she lost all three. She lost one because they died, and she lost the other two to foster care. But, as I put in the beginning of this video, the interview with Steve, you can see he was a very much loving father. He's clearly somebody who wanted something to do with his kids. And so this is not a believable story.
That kind of attitude. Well, I lived with that for 9 months. Well, when Danny was born, Steve, the reason it had to be a girl was because Christy was supposed to be a boy. I was so cruel and mean I had a girl, and Steve just couldn't stand it. Got one more chance, Diane, sure.
She was so cruel and mean that she had a girl. Not Steve. She was so cruel and mean that she had a girl because she wanted a boy. You see how that... You see, when dealing with a narcissist, and this is why I say this is why I said in the last video I would be able to spot out a narcissist at the snap of a finger, is because of the things they say. She was mad because she had a girl, not a boy. not Steve. She treated the child bad because it was a girl, not a boy. And you could look in her eyes, like, if you've never looked into the eyes of a killer, you'll never be able to spot that. But I've covered so many of these different stories. Like I said, I can spot this stuff from a mile away. She did this. She was the one who was mad because it was a girl, not a boy. She even clearly stated that.
Cheryl better be a boy. Well, Cheryl turned out being a girl. He came into the recovery room. He goes, well, where is he? I said, he's a she. He says, how could you do that? You know, we're not having any more kids. Crazy, flipped out. So if I was going to have another one, I better darn sure have a girl. Well, when Danny was born, he was a boy. And my first thought was, I'm dead. He's dead. What's he going to do to that baby? And then I didn't care. I mean, that was my baby. That was supposedly the baby that was going to replace the one that I'd aborted. And as soon as I looked at Danny, I said, you can't. That's a boy baby. And I just knew that the baby I'd aborted was a girl. I'd named her Carrie and everything. There's just a different human being altogether, you know. And a whole lot of emotion on that delivery table. And Steve standing there right beside me looking at me like, you witch. How could you do this? You're out, you know. And Dr. George handed Daniel to Steve. And from that point on, Steve spent the rest of the past 4 years trying to prove to people that he was not biased and not prejudiced, thereby becoming biased and prejudiced.
We've talked to Steve Downs in the past about some of these events. We attempted to contact him again, but his attorney wouldn't allow him to comment because of the trial. Downs knew a lengthy murder trial would make her private life public territory. She's very frank about being a surrogate mother. She ran a surrogate program in Arizona and gave birth to another couple's child. Diane lost visitation rights to her own 2 surviving children after the murder. She was found guilty of contempt of court for seeing them at a secret visit set up by her ex-husband, Steve. Police found out about the visit in a letter Downs wrote to her former boyfriend, Robert Knickerbocker.
Former boyfriend, Robert Knickerbocker. And this is the guy, this is why this all happened. Robert Knickerbocker is why this all happened. Alright, so Steve was trying to be nice and trying to be like, alright, I'm going to let you see your kids. But she still wrote the letter to Robert Knickerbocker. And in the next video that I post, you're going to hear some secretly recorded conversations between the 2 of them that she didn't know was recorded, but he was recording for the cops. But you're gonna hear some really messed up stuff that's really gonna help this put this entire story into perspective, is because the things that are said in those recordings are just mind-boggling to me from both sides. Like, he clearly knew what was up, but he also knew he didn't want to be a dad. And she, like, I'll explain that in that video, but let's keep going.
Known as Nick in Arizona. You fought for Steve to get custody of the kids, and then you wrote a letter to your former boyfriend telling him that Steve was an unfit father for your children. A lot of people won't understand that, Diane.
But Steve is different than most people. Steve pointed an empty gun at my head at one time and pulled the trigger. Do you know why? He wanted me to marry him. That is crazy.
Alright, so you see how that is? That's still a narcissistic thing to do. Alright, so you're fighting for the father of your kids to get custody, but then you're going to turn around and tell a reporter that he pointed the gun at your head because an empty gun. But he pointed an empty gun at your head because he wanted you to marry him. But this is somebody you fought to get custody. You fought for him to get custody of your kids. So him pointing an empty gun at you to get you to marry him didn't stop you from wanting him to take full custody of the kids?
CSD, I believe, that is crazy. CSD, I believe, is very careful in picking out the people that care for a child that they think has been abused. And right now, they believe that Christy has been one of the most abused children in the world. Granted, she was shot, but before that, she was never abused. But they believe that that's probably true. And so they're going to put Christy in a very, very good place. And so I know that Christy's in a good home. Yeah. And so I just decided that it was better that Christy be in a safe, in a mentally stable environment rather than to be with Steve. And if I had walked up to Susan Staffel and said, please don't let them go to Arizona, or if I had called Furtick and asked the same thing, they would have sent the kids, or they would, granted, they could not send the kids. They make suggestions to the court as to what happens to the kids. And they would have suggested to the court that the kids go, merely because I don't want them to. That means Steve and I had a falling out. What?
No, see, and that's again a narcissistic thing to say. Steve said he wanted the kids. Steve said he would have took the kids. But in her mind, they would have not sent the kids because that's what she wanted. And they were going to go against her. And that's the way narcissists are. Like I said, they're either the hero or the victim. And they see everything as a reaction towards them. As, you know, like, the way narcissists view the world is everything in the world revolves around them. So every action is to either benefit them or to hurt them. It has nothing to do with anybody else. And that's just the way narcissists view things.
Better place could they be safe, not realizing that they aren't safe from Steve even, and emotionally. And so I couldn't just count on them to cooperate with me. They haven't so far. I couldn't expect them to now.
Alright, so she's going to sit here and say that they were not safe with Steve emotionally. But she's the one that shot them. So how can somebody who shoots her own kids sit there and say the father of those kids is not safe for them?
And so I had to find another way to tell them. And I know that my ex-boyfriend was a fink. He was taping for the cops. He admitted that he was every conversation that I had with him on the phone was taped and sent immediately to the DA's office. And I knew that that letter, if I sent it to him and he read it, would in fact get to the DA's office. But all the other letters that I'd been sending as of late were being returned. And so I knew that I had to do something to make that letter so enticing that he would open it.
And in my next video, you're actually going to hear the contents of that letter and that conversation between her and Knickerbocker. Because I think it's important to go along with the story. Like I said, this is going to be a 3-part story. Because this video in itself is going to be pretty long. And I'm trying to keep it as short as possible. But for those purposes, let's keep going. But I just wanted to mention that in the next video, you're going to hear the recorded conversations between her and Knickerbocker that explains the contents of those letters.
Downs says she felt trapped in her marriage with Steve and hoped a divorce would solve their problems.
Was there ever a time during that you thought about taking your own life and
Oh, yeah.
went into the bathroom with the gun and shot it?
Yeah.
So that is indeed...
That is true. Only, no, it's not... that's a long one, too. It takes many, many years of being mentally harassed, pushed into a corner. You can't go anywhere. You're trapped. It even stems from my childhood of being trapped. You know that you can't go away. You can't go someplace else. There's no place to escape to because they'll find you. They'll bring you back. Yeah. You'll be punished somehow.
Very common thing with narcissists, like I said, always playing the victim. They're the hero or the victim, never in between. And in this case, she's playing the victim. She's playing the victim of being a poorly mistreated wife, and she's playing the victim of being a poorly mistreated daughter. That's what that is.
Steve was the same type of person. He was the kind of person that, at nighttime especially, was his best time for fighting, and he would just rail on me, just fight and fight and fight, and there was no way to escape, no way at all. Well, after I got my divorce, I figured I was free of that. And I wasn't. Steve would still come to my house and still do the same thing. And this was 2 years after our divorce. And he came to my house, and
She's also, like, she's still saying this story with a smirk. And me as a kid, me personally, I was a bad liar. And the reason I was a bad liar is because I was always, and my mom even pointed this out, was that I would smile or smirk when I was lying. And so that's really kind of what I read from this type of interview, is the way that she's smirking as she's telling this stuff is a clear indication that she's lying.
Had taken a gun. He had a handgun. It was the handgun that he had put to my head, unloaded and fired. And I took it from him. I swiped it from him, and I hid it in my house. And it was in my bedroom. He was doing it again, and he was getting very, very physical. Steve had just beat me up 2 weeks before that, beat me up terribly. There was blood all over the place. The sheriff's department came out and made a report on it, and my nose was all bruised, my face was bruised, my chest was bruised. He had choked me. I was terrified of him. He had never done that before. And for all I knew, this was 2 weeks later, he was going to do it again. And I ran in the bathroom, and, well, I ran in the bedroom and slammed the door. And he was coming through the door anyway, so I grabbed the gun and I ran in the bathroom and locked the door. And my first thought was, I'll never escape from him. I will never, ever get away. I divorced him, and that isn't even getting away from him. It doesn't matter what I do. I'll never get away from the insanity, except just to be oblivious to it. And I considered shooting myself, but it was a .22 handgun, and Steve had said, you can't kill anybody with a .22.
All right, we're going to end it on this note right here. Two notes. Number one, like I said, she's still playing the victim while saying the story with a smirk. So that in itself tells me that she's lying about the whole thing. Number two is she's giving herself a reason as to why she had the gun in her possession. But the crazy thing about that is the gun that she took from him was the gun that was involved in shooting her kids. The .22 Ruger is what shot her kids, which is what she was in possession of. It's the gun that she's referring to, a .22 Ruger. So apparently it can kill somebody if she killed her own kids with it. And again, there's going to be a follow-up video where you're going to hear more details of this, where even the .22 Ruger comes up, Knickerbocker comes up. There's going to be a whole lot more things to kind of help lay this out so that you can make your own opinion on what you think happened. But I'm telling you, this is a narcissistic woman who killed her kids because she loved a man that didn't want her. Well, let me rephrase that. She loved a man who thought he loved her more than he loves his wife. And she thought the only reason that he did not want to be with her was because of her kids, so she killed her kids in order to get him to come running to her. Because she thought that would be the thing that solves the problem. She thought that would be the thing that makes him say, okay, I'm going to be with you. So she took her own kid's life for that reason. So on that note, I'm going to leave it at that. There's still a little bit more onto this. Excuse me. But you're welcome to look up more of the Diane Downs Most Disturbing Interview full 1984 special with Ann, I guess that's Yeager, to get the full interview of this, because there's still about 10 more minutes into this, but I've already dragged this video on long enough. So I'm going to cover it. Like I said, there's going to be another two-part series, two more parts to this story. But I'm going to stop the video there because I've really honestly dragged this on longer than I expected to. And there's still 10 more minutes into this video. So if you want to check out the full interview, look up Diane Downs Most Disturbing Interview full 1984 special with Ann Yeager. And you can watch the whole interview. But that's the reason I wanted to do this. Like I said in the beginning, was because I wanted to touch on the fact of how narcissistic parents look, what they say, how they act, and to see if you can point out those narcissistic traits of a narcissistic parent. And this is why I say, me personally, I'm not a CPS worker, but if I was interviewing a narcissistic parent, I would be able to pick up on this, because I've noticed through this entire interview, she claimed herself as the victim. She didn't shed any tear for her kids, and she gave an explanation on how she ended up with a gun that killed her kids. So, with all that being said, y'all, I hope y'all enjoyed the video. If you did, hit the like button, subscribe button, notification bell, do all that good YouTube stuff to help support the channel. To all current subscribers, I appreciate y'all being here, and I will see y'all in the next one. Y'all have a good one.